What happened in Brussels 3 weeks ago will be studied in economic history courses for the next century as the moment the European Union made the same fatal mistake that destroyed the British Empire, bankrupted the Soviet Union, and is currently hollowing out American global dominance. The European Commission just finalized tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles that represent the most catastrophic act of economic self-sabotage since Britain tried to contain American manufacturing in the 1770s. This is not hyperbole. This is not political commentary. This is structural economic analysis, and the numbers are so clear that every serious economist who is not constrained by political necessity is saying the same thing in private. The European Union just triggered its own terminal decline, and there is no policy mechanism available that can reverse what comes next. Let me be direct about what you are about to hear. The analysis that follows is not what European political leaders are telling their populations. It is not what mainstream European media is reporting, but it is what the structural evidence clearly demonstrates. And if you understand economic history, you will recognize the pattern immediately because it has happened the exact same way every single time throughout the past 3 centuries. 3 questions will structure everything that follows. First, why does every attempt at economic containment destroy the country attempting the containment rather than the target? Second, what specific mechanisms will cause the EU tariffs to accelerate European deindustrialization rather than protect European industry? And third, what does the post-European industrial world look like? And how quickly does that transition occur? There are no comfortable answers tonight. But understanding what comes next is the only thing that matters now because the decisions have already been made and the structural forces are already in motion. Let me start with the question that makes no intuitive sense to most people. Why does economic containment consistently destroy the country attempting it rather than the target? The answer requires understanding something that governments never want to acknowledge, that economic efficiency is not optional, it is deterministic, and any policy that fights against efficiency trends eventually bankrupts the country implementing that policy. Here is the fundamental mechanism. When country A tries to contain country B's economic rise through tariffs, sanctions, or trade restrictions, country A is essentially telling its own population, you must pay higher prices and accept lower quality goods in order to protect our domestic producers from more efficient foreign competition. This creates an immediate wealth transfer from consumers to protected industries. In the short term, this looks like industrial protection. Protected industries maintain employment and production. Politicians declare victory. But here is what happens structurally over the following 5 to 15 years. And this pattern has repeated without exception across every historical case. First, the protected industries stop innovating because they no longer face competitive pressure. Why invest in efficiency improvements when the government guarantees your market share? European automakers have spent the past decade lobbying for protection instead of investing in battery technology and software integration. That choice has consequences. Second, the most capable workers and engineers in protected industries recognize that they are working in dying sectors propped up by political intervention. They leave for more dynamic industries, often in the very countries being contained. Brain drain accelerates. The EU is already experiencing this with its best technical talent moving to Chinese EV companies, offering higher salaries and more advanced research opportunities. Third, and most critically, the efficiency gap between domestic protected industries and foreign competitive industries widens every single year. While European automakers are protected from competition, Chinese manufacturers are competing against each other in the most brutal market environment on Earth, forcing continuous innovation. Every year that passes, European vehicles become less competitive globally, not more. Fourth, the consuming population becomes progressively poorer in real terms because they pay artificially inflated prices, while their export industries lose competitiveness in global markets. The average European family will pay approximately 15,000 euros more for an electric vehicle than necessary because of these tariffs. That is 15,000 euros extracted from household budgets that could have been spent on other goods and services, stimulating actual economic activity. Within 10 to 15 years, the protected industries collapse anyway because the efficiency gap becomes so large that even with tariffs, the foreign competition is still superior and cheaper. But by this point, the domestic industries have atrophied so badly that they cannot be salvaged. The country has spent 15 years becoming progressively poorer, while the targeted country has spent 15 years becoming progressively more advanced. This is not theory. This is exactly what happened to Britain when it tried to protect its textile manufacturers from American competition in the late 1700s and early 1800s. It is exactly what happened to the Soviet Union when it tried to contain Western technology in the 1970s and 1980s. It is exactly what is happening to the United States right now with its tariffs on Chinese technology, and it is exactly what will happen to the European Union over the next decade. Let me give you the specific numbers that make this clear, because the quantitative analysis is devastating. The European Union just imposed tariffs averaging 38% on Chinese electric vehicles. Here's what that means in concrete terms. A Chinese electric vehicle that would cost 25,000 euros now costs 34,500 euros. A European equivalent costs 42,000 euros. European consumers are being forced to pay 68% more than the Chinese vehicle price to buy an inferior European product with worse battery range, worse software integration, and worse build quality. Now let me show you why this destroys the European automotive industry rather than protecting it. The European automotive sector employs approximately 6 million people directly and another 3 million in related industries. Annual revenue is approximately 430 billion euros. The sector represents 7% of EU GDP. Here is the problem. European automakers have a structural cost disadvantage of approximately 40 to 60% compared to Chinese manufacturers for electric vehicles. This is not about labor costs. This is about vertical integration, battery technology, software capabilities, and manufacturing efficiency. Chinese companies like BYD produce their own batteries, semiconductors, and software. European manufacturers assemble vehicles using components purchased from multiple suppliers at markup. The tariffs do not fix this structural disadvantage. They simply hide it from European consumers while the gap continues widening. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers are selling vehicles in every other global market at prices that European manufacturers cannot match even before considering the efficiency gap. What happens next is mechanically predictable. European manufacturers lose market share in every market except their politically protected domestic market. Export revenue collapses in imports war in cheese. Global production volume decreases, which increases per unit cost, which further reduces competitiveness, which further decreases volume. This is a death spiral. Within 5 years, European automotive employment will decline by approximately 30 to 40% as manufacturers close factories serving export markets. Within 10 years, even the protected domestic market cannot sustain current employment levels because the efficiency gap makes European vehicles uncompetitive even with tariff protection as Chinese manufacturers improve quality while reducing costs. But here is the cascade effect that makes this truly catastrophic. The European automotive sector is the anchor customer for European steel, European chemicals, European electronics, and European manufacturing equipment. As automotive production declines, demand for all upstream inputs declines proportionally. Steel mills close. Chemical plants shut down, the entire industrial base contracts. Germany alone will lose approximately 800,000 to 1 million manufacturing jobs over the next decade, directly resulting from this decision. Italy will lose approximately 400,000. France will lose approximately 300,000. Spain will lose approximately 250,000. These are not predictions based on pessimistic assumptions. These are structural calculations based on cost differentials and market dynamics. The total economic impact to EU GDP over the next decade will be approximately 600 billion to 800 billion euros in foregone growth. That is roughly equivalent to losing the entire economy of Poland from the European Union's economic output. Now let me explain why this gets worse, not better. Because while European industry is contracting, Chinese industry is expanding into every market that European manufacturers are losing. Here is what most European analysts are missing entirely. They are framing this as a competition between European and Chinese automotive industries. That is not what this is. This is a competition between the European political system's ability to subsidize inefficiency and the Chinese economic system's ability to generate efficiency gains. Let me show you what I mean with specific numbers. The European Union has announced approximately 150 billion euros in subsidies and support for domestic battery production and EV manufacturing over the next 7 years. This sounds substantial until you understand the scale of Chinese investment. China has invested approximately $230 billion, about 210 billion euros in EV and battery infrastructure in the past 3 years alone. But here's the critical difference. European subsidies are going to established automotive manufacturers with legacy cost structures, legacy dealer networks, legacy unions, and legacy thinking. Chinese investment is going to new companies with optimized cost structures, direct-to-consumer sales models, vertical integration, and software-first architecture. European subsidies are trying to help 100-year-old companies adapt to electric vehicles. Chinese investment is building companies that were designed for electric vehicles from inception. The efficiency difference is structural, not marginal. Let me give you a concrete example. Volkswagen is spending approximately 180 billion euros over 5 years on electrification and digitalization. That sounds like commitment to change. But Volkswagen has 675,000 employees globally, operates 120 production facilities, maintains relationships with 40,000 suppliers, and has contractual obligations to dealer networks in every market. Every decision Volkswagen makes must accommodate these legacy structures. BYD has 570,000 employees but produces more electric vehicles than Volkswagen produces total vehicles. BYD manufactures its own batteries, its own semiconductors, and its own electric motors. BYD sells directly to consumers in China, eliminating dealer markup. BYD designs vehicles using software-defined architecture from the beginning, not retrofitting electric powertrains into chassis designed for combustion engines. The structural cost difference is approximately 45 to 60% depending on vehicle segment. Dit over circa de insight. No amount of subsidy can overcome a 60% structural cost disadvantage when the more efficient competitor is also improving faster. This brings us to the historical pattern that explains why economic containment always fails and why the country attempting containment always suffers more damage than the target. Let me take you back to 1807. Britain was the dominant global economic power, controlling approximately 25% of world trade. British manufacturing was the most advanced on Earth. The British Empire spanned 6 continents. Britain's navy controlled the seas. Britain's currency was the global reserve. The United States was an agrarian economy of 7 million people producing primarily raw materials for export to Europe. American manufacturing was primitive by British standards. American technology was decades behind. Britain saw American manufacturing beginning to develop and made a calculated decision to contain it. Britain imposed tariffs on American manufactured goods. Britain restricted technology exports to America. Britain used its naval power to disrupt American trade routes. Britain told its population that protecting British manufacturers from primitive American competition was necessary for national prosperity. Within 30 years, American manufacturing had become more efficient than British manufacturing in most sectors. Within 50 years, America's economy was larger than Britain's. Within 70 years, American manufactured goods were dominating global markets that Britain had previously controlled. Within 90 years, America had replaced Britain as the dominant global economic power. Britain's attempt at economic containment did not slow American development. It accelerated British decline by forcing British industries to compete with protected rather than market forces, causing British manufacturing to atrophy while American manufacturing advanced. This exact pattern repeated when Britain tried to contain German industrial development in the late 1800s. Germany became Europe's industrial powerhouse anyway, and Britain's relative position declined further. The pattern repeated again when the United States tried to contain Japanese manufacturing in the 1970s and 1980s through tariffs and voluntary export restraints. Japan's automobile and electronics industries became globally dominant anyway, and American manufacturers lost market share in their own domestic market despite protection. The pattern repeated again when the West tried to contain Soviet technology during the Cold War through export controls and sanctions. The Soviet Union developed its own technology anyway, and the Western restrictions simply meant Western companies lost market access while Soviet capabilities advanced independently. The pattern is repeating right now with American attempts to contain Chinese technology through export restrictions, investment bans, and tariffs. Chinese companies are developing domestic alternatives to every restricted technology, and American companies are losing the Chinese market permanently while Chinese capabilities advance toward and then past American levels. Every single time, the containing power assumes that restricting access to their superior technology will prevent the rising power from developing competitive alternatives. Every single time, the rising power develops alternatives anyway, because the economic incentive to do so is enormous. Every single time, the containing power's industries atrophy because they stop competing with market forces. Every single time, the containing power becomes progressively poorer, while the rising power becomes progressively richer. The European Union is now executing this exact pattern for the 6th or 7th time in modern economic history. And the outcome will be exactly the same, because the structural forces are exactly the same. Now let me walk you through what happens next step by step over the next decade. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition based on historical precedent and structural analysis. Phase 1 has already begun. Chinese manufacturers are redirecting investment away from European production and toward production in markets without tariff barriers. BYD just announced it is prioritizing factory construction in Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, and Brazil rather than Hungary. European manufacturing employment begins declining as planned. Chinese investment evaporates. Phase 2 begins within 18 to 24 months. European automotive manufacturers begin reporting catastrophic losses in export markets as Chinese competitors offer superior vehicles at prices European manufacturers cannot match. Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Renault begin announcing factory closures and workforce reductions. European governments respond with additional subsidies which temporarily mask the problem while making it structurally worse. Phase 3 occurs within 3 to 4 years. The efficiency gap between Chinese and European manufacturers widens to the point that even with 38% tariffs, Chinese vehicles are price competitive with European alternatives while offering superior technology. European market share begins declining in Europe's own domestic market despite tariff protection. This is the critical inflection point where the policy failure becomes undeniable. Phase 4 occurs within 5 to 7 years. European automotive employment has declined by 40 to 50%. Multiple European manufacturers have merged, been acquired by Chinese companies, or gone bankrupt. The European Union faces a political crisis as unemployment surges in industrial regions. Governments respond by either increasing tariffs further, which accelerates the death spiral, or removing tariffs, which causes immediate collapse of remaining protected industries. Phase 5 occurs within 8 to 12 years. The European automotive industry, as currently constituted, no longer exists. European vehicle production is either Chinese-owned, Chinese-licensed, or serves only luxury segments too small to sustain the current employment base. The industrial employment base that supported European middle-class prosperity for 70 years has permanently contracted. What does post-industrial Europe look like? Let me show you the most likely scenario based on current trajectories. The European economy of 2035 will be approximately 15 to 20% smaller in real terms than it would have been under continued industrial competitiveness. That represents about 5 trillion euros in cumulative lost output over the decade. The median European household will be approximately 20 to 30% poorer in real terms than the median Chinese household, a complete reversal from 2020 when European households were approximately twice as wealthy. European unemployment will be structurally higher, averaging 9 to 12% rather than the 6 to 7% of the 2010s. Youth unemployment in Southern Europe will exceed 30%. Political instability will increase proportionally. The European Union as a political entity will face existential crisis as northern countries refuse to subsidize southern countries and eastern countries orient economically toward China rather than Western Europe. Europe's global influence will decline to levels not seen since before World War II. European companies will be marginal players in most advanced technology sectors. European currency will be regional rather than global. European political positions on international issues will be largely irrelevant to major powers. This is not a prediction based on pessimistic assumptions. This is the structural outcome that follows mechanically from the decisions already made unless those decisions are reversed within the next 12 to 18 months, which appears politically impossible. Now let me address the obvious question. Could I be wrong about this analysis? Of course. Analysis is not prophecy. Unexpected variables could emerge. Policy could change. Technological breakthroughs could alter trajectories. But here's what I want you to understand. The analytical framework I have shown you tonight, that economic containment destroys the containing power rather than the target, has proven accurate across every historical case for 300 years. The mechanism is consistent. The timeline is consistent. The outcome is consistent. If this analysis is wrong, it will be because something genuinely unprecedented occurs that breaks a pattern that is held across British, American, Soviet, and Japanese cases. That is possible. But betting against a pattern with 100% historical accuracy requires extraordinary evidence. What I encourage you to do is this. Watch what happens over the next 18 months. Watch European automotive employment numbers. Watch Chinese EV market share in global markets outside Europe. Watch European manufacturer profit margins and stock prices. Watch European government subsidy announcements. Compare what you observe to what this analysis predicted. If the structural analysis is correct, you will see European automotive employment beginning to decline significantly by mid-2026. You will see Chinese manufacturers gaining market share in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East at European manufacturers' expense. You will see European companies announcing factory closures and merger discussions. You will see European governments announcing emergency support packages. If those developments occur as the analysis predicts, you will know that the framework is sound and that the longer-term predictions have high probability of accuracy. If those developments do not occur, you will know that something about the analysis was wrong, and we will examine what variables were mismeasured. This is not about rooting for Europe to fail. This is about understanding structural economic forces and recognizing patterns that have repeated across centuries. Empires that try to preserve their positions through economic containment rather than competitive innovation invariably destroy themselves. The European Union is executing that pattern right now. The tragedy is that none of this was necessary. Europe could have chosen to compete by matching Chinese investment in battery technology, vertical integration, and software capabilities. Europe could have chosen to embrace the efficiency gains that Chinese manufacturing represents and focus European industry on sectors where it maintains genuine advantages. Europe could have chosen to participate in the global electric vehicle revolution rather than resist it. Instead, Europe chose protection, subsidies, and containment. And the outcome will be the same outcome that choice has produced every single time throughout modern economic history. We will continue to watch these developments as they unfold over the coming months and years. We will test this analytical framework against observed reality. And we will understand with clarity that politicians cannot afford to acknowledge exactly what the death of European industrial power looks like as it occurs in real time.